research seminar presenter. We heard that you had a very successful research project, and we're very proud of you, so congratulations. And we're very much looking forward to listen to what you're saying.
Thank you very much. Okay. I'm going to present today my research project, Crisis Communication in Theory and Practice. I've done it in an Australian and New Zealand context and compared it with international studies as well. So the purpose of the whole study was to examine what really happens in Australia and New Zealand in terms of crisis communication, then to see are there differences between both countries, and to see are there any differences in comparison to other countries. I reviewed the literature and identified the gaps in the areas of the influence of culture on crisis communication, stakeholder consideration, and strategy applicability. So you could say my whole research project was on crisis communication in an Australian-New Zealand context with special focus on these three gaps identified in the literature. Okay. The initial idea was to use the literature review, do a content analysis of everything published in Australia and New Zealand in regards to crisis communication, and then do additional interviews with practitioners to add more information, more in-depth information. The problem which I soon realized was that the content, it wasn't possible to get information from the content analysis regarding the gaps, because first there wasn't enough published, and second in regards to different topics, so it just didn't cover these areas. So I decided to do the content analysis as an overview to see what happens in theory in Australia and New Zealand, and then to do additional interviews to cover the gaps discovered in the literature review. Okay. To cover the gaps discovered in the literature review, I decided on three main research questions, asking how culture influences crisis communication, how organization size, corporate, non-corporate, industry influences the applicability of the crisis communication strategies, and how stakeholders are considered in Australia and New Zealand. For the sub-questions, which regard the content analysis, I've used an international study done by Kyung and Hui in 2010 as a framework and as a guideline. So I used exactly the same research questions they used to get comparable results. So I asked first to see the amount of articles published in Australia and New Zealand, then what kind of theories have been used. I evaluated the methodological trends, and I looked at what types of crises did they examine, and what kind of theoretical frameworks they used. As I said, the content analysis is based on Kyung's and Hui's study. They had a look at two major public relations journals, the Public Relations Review and the Journal of Public Relations Research, and they looked at articles from 1975 to 2006. I attended to do analysis of the leading public relations and communication journals in Australia and New Zealand as well. It's kind of then, and I thought that's going to be the easy part. So I'm going to use the study which has been done in the US. I'm going to use it as a guideline and as a framework, and I'm just going to replicate it in Australia and New Zealand. The problem was, it wasn't possible. I'm coming to that. The second part of the research project was the interview part. So I've picked 6 practitioners, 3 in Australia and 3 in New Zealand, to interview them and do ask them in-depth questions. All of the participants were members from Prince and Priya. That was done to ensure that there is a certain credibility to their to their interviews, and I've done a comparative analysis with the results from the interviews and the literature. Okay, now to get to my problem of evaluating leading public relations and communication journals in Australia and New Zealand, I've intended to do the last 5 years. So I thought if Shih-Young Kyung and I.m4v examined articles from 1975 to 2006, I'm going to cover the gap and do all the research articles from 2005 till 2010. The problem was I couldn't find anything in New Zealand, so I had to extend the time frame. So if you just have a look, here, you can see these are the sources I had to look at. So I looked at the Australian Journal of Communication, and I found 3 articles in 10 years. I looked at the New Zealand Communication Journal of New Zealand, and I found 0. And I asked Prue for the reason for it, as she is the editor of the journal, and she said it's not that they wouldn't print it, it's only no one submitted anything. Then I had another look, so I tried to mirror the sources, but as Australia I had more sources, it wasn't really possible. So I found the Asian Pacific Public Relations Journal, which was really good, because this one really had, in comparison, a lot of articles regarding crisis communication. As I couldn't find anything else in New Zealand, I had to look at the Public Relations Institutes of New Zealand and Australia. PRIA in Australia prints in New Zealand. And they had on their website articles published, but mainly from practitioners, so not academics. So I decided to do a mix one. So I didn't only look at academic articles printed in journals, I also looked at Public Relations Institute's websites and looked at articles from practitioners. So I found 4 there and 4 on the PRIA website, but you have that's a limitation because it's kind of they only published award-winning cases, so and articles. So it's there could have been more. Only I don't know anything about them because they only published really the award-winning ones, and that were 4 in both cases. Then I looked at Australian and New Zealand Communication Association, and I found 4 articles from Australian authors. I found 0 from New Zealand authors. And there is another public relations online journal. It's called Prism, and there is an equivalent in New Zealand as well. It's called Praxis, but unfortunately Praxis doesn't have any articles online. On the website of Prism I found 2. And as I had only 4 articles in New Zealand and 21 in Australia, I decided to add a communication database search. So I searched EBSCO, which has, I have no idea how many articles online, and I found 2 in New Zealand and 6 in Australia. I have to add that the 2 articles in New Zealand, they are, I would say, borderline, because it's kind of, a lot of the articles were rather about crisis management than crisis communication, but as crisis communication is part of crisis management, they also included parts about crisis communication. So it's kind of, there is a gray area, and it was quite difficult to decide which article is really only on crisis management and which one includes crisis communication or is on crisis communication. So altogether I examined 33 articles, and I created a sample and looked at theoretical frameworks. Interestingly, non-theoretical research was predominant. Non-theoretical means, in this case, according to the study of Shih-Young Kyung and I.m4v, that there is either there is no theory used for the research or there is no theory mentioned. So they said as soon as there is a theory mentioned or used, we are counting that as theoretical research. So non-theoretical research was kind of predominant with nearly 60% to 40% theoretical. The research studies which didn't use any research question, hypothesis, or both were at about 70%, which is really, really high. And if they used theories, most of them cited the issue and crisis management theory, the organizational theory, situational crisis communication theory, apology theory, and attribution theory. I compared these results with the international study and got nearly similar results. So the only it's kind of one of the interesting things was that the international study stated increase in publications. I could see that in Australia as well, whereas in New Zealand the numbers were decreasing. So it's kind of most of the articles were published before 2004, whereas in international in Australia it just started then to increase and nothing was published afterwards in New Zealand. So it seems like either it's the lack of an appropriate public relations journal or there is just no interest. So I checked, as I couldn't find enough articles in New Zealand, I thought I'm going to try it the other way around. So I looked at, while I was doing the database search at international journals and searched for New Zealand authors and Australian authors, and interestingly I found some. So it seems like if Australian or New Zealand authors are publishing, they are rather publishing internationally in the higher profile journals than really locally in the journals there. The high number of non-theoretical research showed quite the opposite results than the international study, which has not only increase in articles, it also had an increase in theoretical articles. When it came to methodology, qualitative research was clearly leading. So again, non-theoretical qualitative research in opposition to the international study, which had exactly the opposite results. Quantitative research was quite low with 12%, and as data gathering procedures were used context analysis, then mixed ones, for example, interviews and content analysis, and then content analysis. As data collection sources, I identified mostly mixed sources, so they used more than one source, media or people. The international study had it was quite interesting to compare it with the international study, as their main data collection method was experiment, and the main source were people. And that, I think, is due to different regulations regarding participants. So in the United States, for example, undergrad students get credits if they participate in research projects. So that's the reason why they have huge numbers of students participating. Would be nice here as well. And that's the reason why they do a lot more experiments with people, because it's much easier to get participants. And it came to research orientation. The focus was on the evaluation of crisis incidents. And it's kind of the crisis most researched, the general crisis, for example, financial crisis, some political issues, whatever, and then followed by mixed crisis, tempering, terror, natural disaster, human error accidents, and technical error accidents. I've tried to compare that with the international study and realized it's quite difficult, as you can't really compare it. For example, the focus on crisis incidents is mainly driven by what happens. So for example, if there is a plane crash in the United States, a lot of the researchers will evaluate exactly this crisis incident. But this crisis incident isn't really something you could refer to one country, because the plane crash could happen everywhere else. And so if, for example, 50% of the research regarding specific crisis incidents, like general crisis, so it was just the crisis happened at that time or shortly before,